as we think about ministry, ministry is not done in a cultural vacuum. It's not something that we live in a little isolated world in which all we have to deal with is a biblical text and we can preach that word effectively. But when we enter into the community, we enter into a culture. We enter into a culture both on the community in which we live, the nation in which we live, the world in which we live, but also we have the culture of the church and how that affects ministry. And we have our own culture that we bring, that every one of us come from a specific culture. And so when we come into a church, we bring with us that culture. And so part of effectiveness in ministry then is learning how to not so much deny our culture, but be willing to adapt our culture and learn their culture and adapt into their culture. And that's what I want us to explore in this segment of our study. Now, before we begin, we need to understand, what is culture? What do we mean when we say culture in that word? A definition that Gary Gorham has given is that culture is the practices, objects, beliefs, and values that constitute a way of life for a people. Now, as we look at that definition, as we think about what that encompasses, it really encompasses everything that we are. That when we talk about culture, it's more than just how we dress, but there involves both tangible and intangible elements. So that culture includes the tangible elements of how we dress, what we eat, what we like. For example, if you were to go up to Canada and you were to go visit someone, the first thing you'd want to do when you entered their home would be to take off your shoes. Now, if you came to my home, that would probably be the last thing you'd want to do, because that is part of culture. If you go to Russia, for example, and you want to impress your loved one that you really cared for her, you would not want to give her a dozen roses, because in Russia, an even number of roses is a sign of death. So you'd want to give an odd number. So as we think about culture and we think about what that means, it encompasses those tangibles. But it also encompasses the intangibles of who we are. Our culture encompasses our hopes, our values, the rules that govern our life, our space relationships, all aspects of our culture. So that as we think about culture, culture is the distinctives that characterize our way of life. It's the way we think. It's the way that enables us to interpret our world in which we live and interact with that world. That's all part of culture. Culture is what determines not only how we act, but it also influences what we're willing to accept, how well we accept other people, whether they are culturally attuned to us or not. So that when we enter into a situation that is very culturally diverse from our culture, we feel very uncomfortable. And missionaries, for example, deal with this when they go into a new ministry that's completely different culture. There's cultural stress that they experience because things are different. They speak a different language. They dress differently. And in this culture, we meld into that culture. But when we go to another culture, all of a sudden we stand out and are very distinct, and that makes us uncomfortable. And so culture includes those things. Now, as we think about culture and the levels of culture, there's really two levels that we might want to look at in terms of culture. The first of all is what we would call personal culture. This is a perspective that is unique to who I am. It's that which influences my individual choices, what I like. Now, my personal culture is influenced by the world in which I live. It's influenced, for example, by my family background, my personal heritage, where I came from. Part of it is genetic in terms of who I am. It encompasses my history. What were the values that my parents had? What were the things that they held to be important? And what did they teach me about that? It encompasses our behavior. It encompasses why I dress the way I do. I grew up on a farm in northern Idaho, so I'm a farm boy. And part of who I am is that farm culture. So it affects how I talk. It affects how I perceive things. It affects what I'm interested in. That's all part of personal culture. Personal culture also includes and is influenced by the church and the religious perspective we have. What is our religious heritage? Did we grow up in a mainline denomination, in a very liberal denomination, or a very evangelical conservative denomination? All of which will influence my own perspective and who I am, my personal culture. My friends have a significant influence on the development of my culture and the ongoing development of my cultural perspective. Who am I associated with? If I are someone who I highly respect and we have a close relationship, we'll tend to dress like they dress. We'll like the things they like. And they will influence my perspective. The community I grow up in and the community I live in will affect my personal culture. But not only do we have a personal culture that influences who we are, but we also have what is called the shared culture. Now, the shared culture is the perspective that we have in common with others that we identify with in a group. So this is our community in which we live. It may be our nation. So that we see things alike. There's a commonality that we have with them. We have a commonness. We have a mutual perspective that we share with one another. This shared culture is influenced by our level of immersion into the larger cultural context. The more immersed we are in that culture, the more we will adapt into that culture and share cultural elements together with them. For example, if we were raised in a particular culture and thus been influenced by that culture, we'll be identifying with it. I grew up on a farm. That's a different culture than the city, and someone who grew up in the inner city. And so I'm more comfortable with farm people. I feel very comfortable when I go into a small farm community. Whereas someone from an inner city might feel very uncomfortable because there's different cultural values in that community. There's different shared culture. But the longer that we live in a specific culture, the more it influences. So, for example, if I were to move to the city, the longer I live in the city, the more I will become immersed into the city culture and more lose the identity that I once had with the rural culture. See, that's part of the shared culture that is influenced by our immersion. A second thing that influences our shared culture is the level of agreement that we have with a particular culture. The more I agree and it has the same values that I have, the more it will influence me and the more we'll have in common with one another. The more we'll accept each other's perspective. But the thing about our culture that we need to recognize is that our culture, both our personal and our shared culture, is what leads us to cultural bias. Now, cultural bias is when we start evaluating others based upon my culture, so that my culture and our culture becomes the right culture, and those who differ from us, we have a bias against them. And it becomes our way is the right way and their way is the wrong way. We see that, for example, and those overseas often talk about the arrogance of Americans because we have an arrogance about us, about our culture. We view our culture as the best culture, that it's the only way to do things, that we do things the best. And so as a result of that, we're biased against others who do things differently. And this does affect in terms of the church. It affects our style, our dress. And the more that we have in common, the more we agree, but the more diverse, the more we'll have a bias against that other culture. For example, sometimes in our view of dress, it's not a biblical issue, but it's a cultural issue. And people who dress differently than we do are culturally wrong. For example, if I were to walk in today and I was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, some of you may say, well, why are you doing that? Why aren't you dressing up? You're the professor, you're the teacher. But if I were to dress like this and go out and visit a farmer, they would say, why are you dressing in a suit? Nobody dresses in a suit, and there would be a natural bias against that. And in the church, oftentimes what happens is we take these cultural biases and we read them into Scripture so that we no longer make it a cultural issue, we make it a spiritual issue. We do this with style of music. We all know and are aware of the music wars that exist within the church. Hymns versus choruses. And we hold these as spiritual values. So if you're a hymn person, it's because you're not willing to change and adapt to the new culture. You don't care about the young people. But if you're a chorus person, you view the hymn people as traditional, unchanging, and stuck in their ways, and therefore unspiritual. And so our cultural bias we begin to incorporate into Scripture. And the more diverse we are, the more biased we are in our culture. We need to understand that. So that what causes most divisions is not the issue of ethnicity, but it's the issue of cultural characteristics. Now we need to understand that culture, as it relates to morality, that all cultures have elements of moral error. It doesn't matter the culture, what it is, whether it's an American culture, a Chinese culture, a Russian culture, an African culture, whatever that culture is, there are elements that culture is in violation of biblical truth. It's in conflict with that. Now, as we go into a culture, especially if we're coming from the outside, we can see those areas. But we need to be careful. And one of the mistakes that we often make, even in ministry, is that we go into a new church and we see areas of their culture that is in violation of Scripture, and so we immediately want to address those. But the thing we need to keep in mind, and we'll talk more about this in a bit, is that before we can begin to make those changes and deal with those issues, we need to develop trust with the people within that setting. And that crucial for ministry is developing trust. And we do that by coming into their culture and adapting into their culture in the ways that are not in violation of Scripture. But we need to understand it. We also need to understand that that's true of my own culture. That there are elements of my culture, both in terms of my shared culture, as well as my personal culture, that are in violation of Scripture. That some of my perspectives are wrong. Some of my perspectives leads to a judgmentalism. And we need to address that. For example, one of the cultural elements of the farm background is that basically it's kind of a mindset that God blesses those who work. That if you work hard, God will bless, and it's kind of the same mentality that Job's friends had. And as a result of that, there's kind of the mindset that each person is to take care of themselves. And so if someone is poor and impoverished, it's not because of the economic issues of the day. It's because they have made choices that they're either lazy or they don't want to work, and so we become judgmental of them, even though Scripture tells us and warns us continually about being judgmental of the poor and not being sensitive to the poor. And so we have those elements where our culture is in conflict with the culture or with the biblical perspective. The second thing we need to recognize about culture in the Scriptures is that all cultures have elements of moral neutrality. That there are elements of our culture that are morally neutral. The Bible doesn't address it one way or another. How we dress, for example. The Bible doesn't tell us that we're to wear a suit and tie. It doesn't tell us that we're to wear a t-shirt and jeans. These become cultural issues. Many of the issues concerning the style of music that we enjoy are morally neutral. And so we can be sensitive to those areas. But lastly, all cultures have elements that support biblical truth and support biblical morality. That as we look in the culture, there are elements in which they are upholding what we find in Scripture, some of the values that we see in Scripture. Now, as we look at culture, one of the areas that this becomes crucial in is that these become the contact points for our witness. That as we go into a culture and as we minister within the context of that culture, then we have a contact point, a point of commonality from which we can build trust that we can then proclaim the gospel of Christ. So we need to understand the importance of culture in its formation of morality, in its formation of how we think. And we need to understand the culture because it's crucial that as we go into a ministry that we understand the people, we understand how they think, we understand how the community thinks. And the reason for that is, first of all, that understanding the culture is crucial because all ministry is cross-cultural. Now, one of the mistakes that we make as we go into ministry, especially as we minister here in the context of the States, or if we're from Canada, up in Canada, is that we go into ministry and we assume that because I'm an American and the church I am serving is in America, it's the same culture. But the moment we walk outside of our church that we grew up in, we walk in to another culture. That when we arrive at a new field, when we arrive at a new pastorate, we need to recognize that we are crossing cultural boundaries. It's a cross-cultural ministry. And because of that, we need to recognize that, and we need to think cross-culturally. Normally, when we think of cross-cultural ministry, we think of missionaries. We think of someone who has grown up in the States, and they grew up here, but they're going to serve in the Lord in Southeast Asia, and that's a cross-cultural ministry. And so we recognize that person then has to make cultural adaptations to be effective in that ministry. But what we also need to recognize is that's true for us as well. That's true of us serving in the church. If we have come from a city and we are going into a rural area, that's a cross-cultural ministry. Oftentimes the communities may be very close together. For a number of years, I was pastoring two small churches. They were 5 miles apart. Very different cultures within those two different communities. And we need to understand that. One community was much more of a bedroom type of community, much more of a upper middle class community. The other was a very lower class of community. It was a rougher community. Many more broken homes, and so it had a different culture. And so that even though they had the same pastor serving both churches, they had to be two different ministries. because there's two different cultures. So we need to assess culture. We need to evaluate culture to be effective in crossing cultural boundaries. And to do that, we need to avoid becoming critical of other cultures. One of the things that I have found in terms of my study of the small church and comparing that to leadership today, and many times those who are the most critical of the small church are those who have failed to understand the culture of the small church. They have stood on the outside and failed to realize that just because that church exists in close proximity to their ministry does not mean it's the same culture. And what they're criticizing oftentimes is cultural issues. But we need to recognize those. Secondly, understanding the culture enables us to minister to the needs of people. Culture influences our perception of needs. For example, in the American culture, we would define economic needs vastly different from how the third world country and culture would define economic needs. We need to understand that. We need to understand what people perceive to be important and of value and what is not. We need to understand the culture so that we can identify what the perceived needs are as a starting point for ministry. Now, granted, we're not to encompass our total ministry by just trying to meet people's perceived needs. We need to focus our ministry on meeting their spiritual needs. But the starting point oftentimes is their perceived cultural issue. And we can begin there. And then begin from there to move to the spiritual needs that they had. Christ, for example, did this with the woman at the well. That he began by starting with her culture and with her perceived needs in terms of drink, and then moving to her cultural perspective of religion. And then he moved from that point then to the presentation of the living water that Christ had to offer. But that's how we minister to people. We minister cross-culturally. So as we understand their culture, we can minister to their needs and minister effectively. Thirdly, in understanding our culture, it enables us to adapt our ministry to the people. You see, time and location greatly affects the mindset, the worldview, and the attitudes of people. Certainly we see that, for example, in our own country, that when the terrorists struck the World Trade Centers on 9/11, at that moment there was a huge cultural shift that occurred in our country. That as a result of that one event, the perception of people was radically altered. So people today view the world differently than they did before that event. And that's true of each one of us. As time and events happen in our life, our perspectives change. As time passes, people change because culture changes. Culture is not something that's static. It's not something written in concrete, but rather it's very fluid. It's always in flux. It's always changing as people encounter new ideas or they encounter different events in their life. And because of that, our ministry needs to continually adapt. What worked 20, 30, 40 years ago and was effective in ministry no longer works today because the culture is different. For example, 50, 60 years ago, if you wanted to reach out into the community with an evangelistic event, what you would do is plan some kind of a special musical meeting, and you would have an evangelist come for a week of meetings. And he would often come, and he would often bring maybe a musical group with him, or maybe he himself was a singer, and so in conjunction with the evangelistic message, he would give a concert or some kind of activity that would draw people. And people would come from the community. Why? Because 40, 50 years ago, the church was the social center of a community. And people would come to those type of events because it was a social event. And they didn't have the opportunity to have those kind of social events elsewhere, and so they'd come to the church. But now, if we were to attempt that same type of ministry today, we'd find the only ones who would show up would be the church people. Why? Because the church is no longer the social center of a community. In fact, there are multitudes of social centers in a community. There's social organizations such as Lions and different organizations such as that serve as social centers. There's the schools, there's sports. All these things form different social centers, so people no longer come to the church for a social event because the culture has changed. Location affects people's culture. How people view the world differs greatly in different locations, even geographically, when they're in close proximity. And so we need to be sensitive to these changes. A rural area in Montana differs in its cultural perspective than even a rural area in the Northwest. And the Northwest would differ greatly from its perspective from people who live in the South. Different culture. Canada, we think, is very much like us. They speak the same language. But there are many cultural issues that are different in Canada that are radically different from the United States. And we can't just go up into Canada and begin ministry in Canada thinking that the culture is the same, because it's not. There's a different perspective, because location affects. Go up into Alaska. It's a different culture, different perspective, a different outlook on life than it is down in the States, different values. So time and location affects culture, and if we're to be effective in adapting our ministry to the people and to ministering to people, we need to understand the culture. Fourth, we need to understand the culture in order to effectively communicate the gospel. In Acts chapter 17, Paul gives us a good example of someone who did just this. In Acts chapter 17 is when we find that Paul goes into the philosophers of Athens, and he begins by sharing with them that he came and he saw a marker to an unknown God. And so he started where they're at. He understood their culture. He understood some of their values and began at that point then to bring them to a point of presentation of the gospel. And so while the gospel never changes, the message of the gospel never changes, the method by which we communicate that gospel will change as the culture changes. If we don't understand the culture, oftentimes what happens is we'll be communicating the gospel in a way that people do not understand, that they can't comprehend because of the cultural difference. We speak a cultural language that they cannot identify with or grasp. And so we need to understand the culture. Fifth, to understand our culture enables us to be accepted by people. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 23, Paul gives us a cultural perspective. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19, Paul says, "Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jew I became like a Jew to win the Jew. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings." And so we find what Paul is saying here is that there was a cultural adaptation that he demonstrated in his own ministry. That he adapted his culture to their culture so that he would be effective in ministering to them. See, if we're to gain acceptance into a community, if we're to go into a community and gain their trust, we have to adapt into their culture. Otherwise, we'll always be viewed as an outsider, someone to be looked upon with suspicion, someone to be held at arm's length, rather than someone to be embraced. Because understanding the culture is crucial for them to learn to trust us. That as we understand their culture and adapt into their culture and respect them within the context of that culture, they can learn that they can trust us and they can value us and accept us. We gain their trust, and we must gain their trust before we can be accepted into the group. Not only will they learn to trust us, but as we adapt into their culture, we can learn to trust them. We begin to see that the cultural differences are not in violation of Scripture, but actually they're points of commonality that we can adjust to. And we can trust them. We can trust their perspective. We will not feel threatened by them. So as we go into a small church, we go and we begin to understand their culture. We begin to understand what is the role of the power brokers in the church. Why do they have that role? So that instead of being threatened by them and threatened by the authority that the congregation gives them, we can learn to trust them because we understand the culture from which they come. 6, understanding our culture enables us to identify our target group. You see, in order for us to reach people, we need to understand who they are. I grew up on an Indian reservation, and one of the tragedies is that the white church was never able to penetrate into the Native American with the gospel of Christ. And part of the reason is because we approached them from a white perspective. You see, and if we are to be effective in reaching our target groups, we need to understand their culture and who they are, and why they think the way they do, and how they think. Now, I think in terms of our culture and understanding the culture, there is a warning that we need to be aware of. And that is that we are to be culturally sensitive, but not culturally driven. And by that, I mean that in terms of our understanding of culture, we need to be sensitive to the way people think, but we must always remain biblically driven. That ultimately what drives us is Scripture. And secondly, not only in terms of their culture or the culture in which we live, but in terms of even our own culture, we must not be biblically driven, but we must always be we must not be culturally driven, but we should always be culturally critical. And by that I mean that we should be evaluating our culture. Not in the sense of being judgmental of those who are different, but evaluating what is our culture? What are the areas of our culture that we are in violation of Scripture? And that begins by looking at my own culture. Looking at my own personal and shared culture and say, where are the areas that I'm in error? Where are the areas that I am in contradiction to Scripture? And how do I need to change them? But we need to understand our culture because it's a cross-cultural ministry. Now, as we think about understanding our culture, certainly there are a number of areas that we could look at. But I'd like to just look at 6 areas that Sherwood Lingenfelter examines in his book, Ministering Cross-Culturally. That gives us a little bit perspective in terms of how people think and how groups think in terms of their culture. First of all, in terms of culture, there are time versus event orientations. Time-oriented people are those who are concerned with punctuality. There are those who look at the clock. They are the ones who start on time and they want to end on time, and they evaluate things by a time-oriented outlook on life. For them, schedule is important. Goal-directed activities, and so that there's a careful allocation of time to achieve maximum accomplishments. There's a focus on dates and history. Event-oriented people, on the other hand, are concerned not so much with the time, but with the accomplishments. They focus on what needs to happen rather than when it will happen. Time-oriented people look at when things happen. Event-oriented people look at what needs to happen. They have more of a come-what-may outlook, not tied to a precise schedule. Now, in terms of culture, we often find, for example, the rural culture tends to be more event-oriented. Farmers don't operate by a time schedule. If you go into a rural area and you call a farmer and say, let's meet at 10 o'clock down at the local restaurant, he may show up at 9:30 or he may show up at 10:30. Part of that is because of their location, their business, their job. That they're out there and they're doing activities, and if the cow gets out, they can't stop and say, well, I've got an appointment. But rather they need to get the cattle in, then they will move on to the next event. And so they're more event-oriented. You go into a city where everything is more run by a clock, and they're more time-oriented. So you arrive in the city, and if you start the church 10 minutes late, or if you go 10 minutes overtime, people get a little upset because they're time-oriented. And so one of the cultural perspectives is time versus event orientation. The second is dichotomistic versus holistic thinking. The dichotomistic person is the one who has great concern for the particulars of a problem or situation and reduce them to a right and wrong. They tend to think in black and white in their thought process. They make judgments based upon right and wrong and a specified criteria by which they uniformly apply to everyone. That security comes from a feeling of that one is right and fits into the particular role that one has been assigned. Holistic thinking, on the other hand, do not separate things into all these nice categories, but rather they tend to look at the larger picture. Judgments are more open-ended. They're more informational, and experience are seemingly disorganized. They're not concerned about details. They're concerned about the whole picture. Another cultural perspective is crisis versus non-crisis orientation. Crisis-orientated individuals are those who emphasize anticipating the crisis. They are the ones who want to be planning ahead and making sure that we've got all the different options available. And we've thought through all the possible results. We've thought through all the possible effects that will happen. So they're quick to make the resolutions to avoid any ambiguity. They want procedures. They seek expert advice to avoid any potential crisis. Non-crisis orientated people, on the other hand, downplay the possibility of crisis, and they focus upon the present, the here and now. They're the ones who are not worried about what's going to happen tomorrow. They're not worried about a crisis that's going to happen. Now what happens is on the board is you get two of these individuals, and this one person wants to make sure that we're planning all possible solutions or all possible outcomes and dealing with them, while the other person says, hey, let's just get to the task here at hand. And so that can be frustrating at times. Or if we're a crisis-oriented who says, we need to make sure that we're being proactive in our thinking rather than reactive. Whereas a non-crisis person will say, let's not worry about tomorrow, let's only take care of today. And so people tend to think. Rural people, for example, tend to be more non-crisis in their orientation. So, for example, when it comes to church budgets, They set the budget up for the year, but then they don't really look at it the rest of the year. Why? Because, well, when the time comes and we need some money, then we'll have it. Whereas in the city, it's more of a crisis-oriented. We need to budget, and we need to follow that budget to make sure that we don't have a financial crisis 6 months down the road. So we need to plan ahead. We need to make sure we have some money in some money markets for a rainy day. Different perspectives. Task versus people orientation. Task-oriented people focus upon the tasks and upon principles. They find satisfaction with the achievement of goals. And they seek friends then who have similar goals. And they push forward. For them, acceptance of loneliness and social isolation for the sake of personal achievement is acceptable to them. Why? Because they want to make sure they accomplish the task. People-orientation, on the other hand, focus upon relationships and find satisfaction. And so again, oftentimes, and again, these are generalizations, but oftentimes in the rural areas, there tend to be more people-oriented, whereas in the business world, they tend to be more task-oriented. Or the same may be true in terms of the small church versus a large church. In the small church tends to be more people-oriented. We don't care about the accomplishments, we care about relationships. Whereas in the larger church, there is a culture that's more task-oriented. Let's make sure we get things done. Different cultural perspectives. Status versus achievement focused. Status-oriented people look at prestige as something that is ascribed. You are given your particular lot in life. For example, in India, we think of the historical caste system. It's a very status-oriented culture. That you're born into your status and you exist within that status. You exist within your role, and you're expected to play out that role within the culture. Achievement-focused cultures are more prestige is attainment. It doesn't matter where you've come from, it only matters what you've accomplished. And so more of our culture here in America, we tend to be more achievement-oriented. We evaluate people by their achievements rather than their caste level. Different cultural perspectives. Concealment versus openness orientations. Concealment cultures are cultures that do not want to be open. They don't want to take a risk. They don't want to open themselves up to embarrassment. They're very protective of their self-image at all costs. They want to avoid errors. They want to emphasize quality of performance. For example, we think of the Japanese culture, where saving face is extremely important to them. Where willingness is more of a culture, or more of those who are, or openness cultures are those who are not afraid to be open and honest. They're more willing to share, unconcerned about errors, willing to push the limits, willing to try things and fail. That's more of our American culture in which we live. But sometimes that can be true in terms of even communities. Some communities are naturally more open. They're willing to share. Others are more closed, that you respect the other person's privacy. You don't talk about their personal issues. And so we need to recognize that aspect of orientation. And there's much more that we could talk about in terms of culture and different ways people perceive things. But we need to strive to understand the culture. We need to strive to look at that culture from within that culture. Not to prejudge it, not to evaluate it based upon our cultural perspective, but to go into that culture and to view it from within that context and respect that culture. And as we do that, then we begin to build trust. because building trust is crucial for ministry. And if we're to be effective in ministry, we have to build a trust relationship with the people we serve, and that comes through the acceptance within the culture. And so we need to ask ourselves, how are we building trust? What am I doing? What am I thinking? What am I saying that builds trust or undermines trust? And how can I do that? Well, it comes through our culture. As we think about trust, there's really 5 levels of trust that we have. The first level is the stranger. This is the person that there's no cultural adaptation. In fact, there's cultural bias. And so there's suspicion, there's rejection. And so, for example, a pastor comes in. And a pastor has a cultural bias against the cultural elements of that particular community or that particular church. And instead of adapting to that culture, learning that culture, he judges that culture. And as a result, the people always view him as a stranger. They always hold him at arm's length. They reject his leadership as he rejects them. Oftentimes, people who are critical of the small church are individuals who have their own cultural bias. Perhaps they had a bad experience in a small church, and as a result, they arrive into a new ministry and they bring that bias with them. And they prejudge what the church is going to do, and as a result, they become critical of it. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that the church then rejects their leadership. The second level is the outsider. The outsider is one who has minimal shared cultural adaptation. In other words, there's some elements of commonality in their shared culture. There's some elements of cultural respect and acceptance, but there's no real adaptation. Remember one time I was talking to a layperson in a church. And we were talking about the pastor, and I said, well, how do you like your new pastor? And they made this statement. They said, well, we like him. He's a good preacher, but he doesn't come out and visit us in the field. He doesn't come and ride the combine with us. He doesn't come and ride the truck with us. You see, what were they saying? What was they saying? They're saying that here is the pastor. He's a good preacher. He knows the word, but he's not willing to adapt into our culture. He doesn't care about our culture. And as a result, he's always going to be viewed on as an outsider. When I went to Montana to pastor a church in Montana, because I grew up on the farm, I knew all about farming and knew how to drive combine and tractor. One day during harvest, I went out to visit one of the farmers that in the area that was coming to our church. And as I was riding around the field with him on the combine, he asked me, he says, well, do you want to drive the combine? And I said, sure. And so he got out of the seat, and I got in, and to his amazement, all of a sudden this preacher, he didn't know preachers could drive combines, but all of a sudden this preacher started driving the combine. From that moment on, I was viewed as an insider in that community, because I was no longer someone who was outside, but I was someone who was one of them. I wasn't just a pastor, I was a farmer in their eyes. Because now we had the same culture. But if we don't have that, if we tend to reject them, we're always going to be viewed on as an outsider. Even though we may respect them, they may respect us, but we're still going to be viewed as an outsider. And so there's going to be suspicion. A third level of trust, though, is a community member. This is where we have shared cultural, community culture, that we're willing to adapt into the community culture. This cultural adaptation. There's not a lot in terms of personal culture and some of the personal preferences, but yet we're becoming part of the community. We have those shared values. We may not enjoy all the things that they enjoy. We may not enjoy all the personal hobbies or music that they have, but we're willing to adapt. There's trust on a non-value issues. So we become part of the community. And we're seen as a part of a community. We oftentimes see this in in the church, where the pastor is viewed on as a community member. And they see him as someone who's a part of the community. But then there's the neighbor. Not only is there the shared community culture, but there's also the peripheral or the beginning of the shared personal culture. So that there's a mutual respect and acceptance of one another. So no longer are you viewed as, well, just a pastor down the road, but all of a sudden you're viewed as my neighbor, next door neighbor. Someone that I can visit with, someone that I can say hi to. And so in the community, we want to strive to develop this kind of level so that we're not just a part of the community, that we're becoming part of their neighbor. We're a neighbor to them. We're someone who accepts them, and they accept us, and there's shared personal interests. And then lastly, there's the most intimate level, and that is the personal friend, where there's shared personal culture, there's shared values. From a biblical perspective, this would come in terms of fellowship, mutual encouragement of one another. There's a high degree of shared community and personal culture and values. And there's the intimate of relationship. There's the sharing and trust to share the struggles and difficulties. And we're willing to be vulnerable and open because we have that same commonality. But it's important for us as we go into a church that we recognize that in order for us to reach this level within the church, we have to adapt into their culture. We have to begin to learn their culture, so that we begin to form a bond with them. It's interesting that when God became incarnate on this earth, He didn't come culturally neutral, but rather He came as part of the Jewish culture. If we were to be transported back in time to the time when Christ walked the earth, He would look Jewish. He dressed Jewish. He spoke the Jewish language. He adapted into their culture. He became incarnate within the context of the culture of the Jewish community. You see, that's what we must do in terms of ministry. We must be willing to be like Christ. It's not that we're going to deny or reject our culture, but we recognize that we need to be willing to be a child again. To be willing to be taught from the people that we serve their culture, their way of life, their perspective, their thinking, so that we can adapt into that culture, that we can understand that context, and minister within the context of that church. So we must accept the validity of their culture rather than being judgmental of that. We're willing to learn. But as we think about culture, especially in terms of the town and country culture, there are some distinctives that we need to be aware of. First of all, that town and country culture is very diverse. That there's not a specific town and country culture that characterizes all across the nation. Remember, time and location affects culture. That just because I grew up on a farm does not mean that I will adapt completely into another farm culture in the Midwest. But there's very diverse culture. We see a diverse culture because of the influx of different ethnic groups, even within the town and country areas. A second thing about culture is that they tend to be very pragmatic in their outlook on life. They want to know what works. They don't want the theoretical, they want the practical. They're not concerned about the theoretical of biblical truth. They want to know the practical. Well, how does this affect how I'm supposed to do things today? What do I need to do in response? So as we teach, for example, theology within the context of a town and country church, we don't need to get so hung up on the philosophy of theology, but rather on the practical side of theology. Okay, here's what the sovereignty of God means for us today. Here's how it relates to us today. They want to know what works and how it affects their lives. They have a high work ethic. Probably a better way to say it would be a high physical work ethic. They judge people by how hard they work physically. That's true even of pastors, that they tend to look on it. How hard is the pastor willing to work physically, because they work hard physically. And if a pastor, from their perspective, is one who spends all of his time in the office with a nice shirt and tie, but is not willing to get out and get dirty, they're going to always see him as an outsider. They're very community-minded, so that they evaluate people by how much they're contributing to the well-being of the whole community. And again, as we go in and serve as pastors, we need to recognize that part of their evaluation of us is, do they see us as someone who's contributing to the well-being of the whole community? That's why it's so crucial for us to get involved in community activities, to get involved in some of the emergency services, volunteer emergency services, such as volunteer fire department. Because that's a crucial element to show them that we are part of their community, that we support and strive the growth and the well-being of the community. They also are very ritual-oriented or very traditional-oriented. See, rituals are part of the way people live. And they form a central fabric in terms of how they order their life. We see that in town and country. For example, we see that in the county fair as an essential ritual. We may see it in the parades, the 4th of July parade or the celebration of a holiday. We see it in the sports activities at the high school. All part of the rituals, things that are done as part of their culture and part of their identity. Weddings and funerals are important rituals that people perform, because it's part of the social fabric that defines their culture and passes on their culture to the next generation.